The sun had no mercy in Dusty Creek. It pressed down on the town like a flat iron on dry cloth, bleaching the wooden storefronts, cracking the earth between the wagon ruts, and drawing the sweat from every living thing that dared stand beneath it. The hills beyond town were the color of old bone. The creek that gave Dusty Creek its name had shrunk to a muddy trickle 3 summers ago, and most folks quietly blamed God. The ones who knew better blamed Colonel Harlan Voss. Voss owned the bank on Main Street, the feed store beside it, and the water rights to every well within 12 miles. He was a wide man with small eyes and a silver watch chain he polished every morning, as though the shine of it might distract from the rust underneath. He had come to Dusty Creek 15 years ago with a lawyer and a land map, and he had not stopped acquiring since. Ranches folded, families packed wagons, and Voss's shadow stretched longer every season. But today was auction day, and the whole town had come out regardless. The Frontier Bride auction was an old custom in these parts, rough around the edges, but legal, and understood by all who participated. Women without family or means could register, stand before the town, and find themselves a husband and a household. The arrangement lasted 30 days, after which the woman held full right to refuse and walk away. It was not romance. It was survival dressed in practicality. Most years, the women were claimed quickly, young, nervous girls from failed homesteads, grateful for any offer. This year was different. The stagecoach from the Eastern Line had rolled in just before noon, coating itself in a long tail of pale dust. When the door opened and Eleanor Marsh stepped down, the crowd on the boardwalk went quiet in the particular way that meant people were forming opinions faster than they could speak them. She was 27 years old, though she carried herself with the steadiness of someone who had lived twice that inexperience. Tall, with dark hair pinned firmly beneath a traveling hat, and eyes the color of river water, gray-green and moving, always moving, taking in everything at once. Her dress was practical, worn from the journey, but she brushed it down with one hand and lifted her chin as though she had arrived at a place she had chosen rather than a place she had been sent. She was, by any measure, beautiful. The kind of beautiful that made men uncertain, because it came attached to something they couldn't immediately name or easily dismiss. The auctioneer, a reedy man named Pickett with a string tie and a nervous habit of clearing his throat, called the proceedings to order on the steps of the courthouse. A small platform had been set up. Ellie stepped onto it without hesitation. The bidding opened. First man, a cattleman from the south end of the county, raised his hand, then lowered it when 2 of Voss's ranch hands appeared at his shoulder and murmured something close to his ear. He found a sudden and convenient interest in the ground. The second man, a shopkeeper who'd shown genuine interest, received a look from Voss himself, just a look from across the street, steady and cold as a rifle barrel. He did not bid. The whispers in the crowd grew, too old, too proud, too sharp about the eyes. Women leaned into their husbands. Men studied their boots. The auctioneer cleared his throat again and again, calling for offers that did not come. Ellie stood on that platform and did not move. She did not plead. She did not soften herself for their comfort. Her jaw was set, her hands were folded in front of her, and she held the locked leather satchel at her side as though it were the most natural thing in the world to carry. Whatever storm moved behind those river-gray eyes, she did not let it reach her face. At the back of the crowd, leaning against the post of the hardware store with his hat pulled low, stood Caleb Holt. He was 34, lean from work rather than hunger, with sun-darkened skin and the kind of silence that came not from having nothing to say, but from being careful about what he chose to. He owned 40 acres on the north edge of town, the last independent ranch Voss had not yet managed to swallow. It wasn't much, but it was his, and every nail in the fence line had been driven by his own hands. He had come to town for feed and wire. He had not come for this. He watched the auction with a discomfort that grew heavier by the minute, watched Voss's men work the crowd like a slow poison, watched the woman on the platform stand with her chin up while the town quietly decided she was worth nothing. Caleb pushed off the post. He walked through the crowd slowly, and people moved aside without quite knowing why. He stopped in front of Pickett, reached into his coat and placed a folded document on the auctioneer's podium. "The deed to Holt Ranch," he said clearly. 40 acres, north pasture, and the house. That's my bid." The crowd went absolutely still. Across the street, Colonel Harlan Voss stopped polishing his watch chain. On the platform, for the first time since she had stepped off that stagecoach, Eleanor Marsh blinked. She turned her river-gray eyes on the quiet man standing below her, this stranger who had just placed everything he owned on a podium for a woman whose name he did not yet know. Pickett swallowed hard, looked around for any competing offer, found none, and brought down the gavel. Caleb looked up at her. Ellie looked down at him. Neither of them smiled. But something passed between them in that sun-hammered silence, quiet and serious and impossible to name, like the first distant rumble of a storm that has not yet decided what it intends to become. The ride to Holt Ranch took 20 minutes. They did not speak for the first 15 of them. The wagon rolled north along a rutted trail, past scrub brush and fence posts in the long amber stillness of the afternoon. Caleb kept his eyes on the horse. Ellie kept hers on the horizon. The locked satchel sat between them on the bench like a third passenger, present, deliberate, and saying nothing. It was Ellie who broke the silence. "Why did you do it?" Caleb didn't answer immediately. He guided the wagon around a dry gully before he spoke. "Because nobody should stand on a platform and be worth nothing, and I didn't believe you were." Ellie studied the side of his face. "You don't know me." "No," he agreed, "I don't." She turned back to the horizon. "That's either the bravest thing I've ever heard," she said quietly, "or the most foolish." "Might be both," Caleb said. And something at the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the shape of one. The ranch appeared as the trail curved, a modest house, a solid barn, a windmill turning slowly against the pale sky. It was not grand, but every board was straight, every gate was hinged properly, and the garden beside the porch had been tended recently. Ellie noticed all of it. Inside, Caleb showed her to a room with a clean quilt and a window that faced east. 30 days, he said, stopping at the doorway. "The arrangement is yours to end whenever you choose. You have your own room, your own space. I won't pretend this is something it isn't." He paused. "But while you're here, this is your home." Ellie set the satchel carefully on the chair beside the bed. "I appreciate plainness," she said. "Most people don't offer it." "Most people are afraid of it," Caleb replied and left her to rest. The first week surprised them both. Ellie did not stay indoors. She was up before sunrise, moving through the ranch with an ease that confused Caleb until he stopped being confused and simply accepted it. She could ride well, better than well. She repaired a section of fence on the east pasture without being asked, reading the land slope with her eyes before driving a single post. She could cook, though she admitted it was her second-best skill, and in the evenings she sat at the table reading survey maps by lamplight with the focused attention of someone studying a language they already half knew. On the fourth evening, Caleb set down his coffee cup and said, "You're not what you appeared to be at that auction." Ellie looked up from the maps. "Neither were you." They held the moment carefully, like something that might startle if handled wrong. By the second week, the walls between them had not fallen, but they had developed doors. Quiet conversations on the porch after supper. The way Caleb noticed when she was tired before she said so. The way Ellie had begun to laugh at his dry, understated humor, a real laugh, unguarded, that seemed to surprise her each time it escaped. And then, on a Tuesday evening when the sky was doing something extraordinary in shades of copper and rose, Ellie unlocked the satchel. She placed the documents on the table between them without ceremony. "I came to Dusty Creek on purpose," she said. "I'm a trained land surveyor and legal clerk. I worked for the federal land office in St. Louis under Judge Harmon Price." She watched Caleb's face. "These are federal documents, surveys, title records, sworn depositions. They prove that Colonel Harlan Voss has been committing land fraud for over a decade, falsifying deeds, stealing water rights, manipulating county records." She paused and pressed one document forward. "Including the original deed to your ranch, Caleb. Voss altered it 7 years ago. This land was always yours, fully and legally. He's been manufacturing a claim against it." The lamplight moved across Caleb's face. He was very still. "Judge Price was threatened into silence last spring," Ellie continued. "I came voluntarily. I entered the auction as a cover. I needed to be in town without drawing Voss's attention." She folded her hands. "I never expected the auction to go the way it did. I never expected—" She stopped. "Me," Caleb said quietly. "Anyone like you," she said honestly. Caleb looked at the documents for a long moment, then he looked at her. "You carried all of this alone." "I'm accustomed to carrying things alone." He nodded slowly, the nod of a man who understood that particular weight from the inside. "They came at midnight. 4 riders, no torches, moving fast across the north pasture." Caleb heard them first, a rancher's instinct, tuned to the sounds his land made at night. He was at the door with his rifle before they reached the yard. Ellie was beside him 30 seconds later with the satchel already in her arms. The riders tore through the barn, overturned the supply shelves, demanded the papers. Caleb stood his ground with a steadiness that made 2 of the men hesitate. Ellie moved in the darkness behind the house, hiding the documents beneath the floorboard she had identified on her second day, because Eleanor Marsh always identified the exits and always found the safest place before she needed them. The riders left with nothing. In the shaken quiet that followed, standing in the dark kitchen with dust still settling around them, Caleb turned to her. His voice was low and unhurried. "I didn't know what I was saving that day at the auction," he said, "but I'd do it again." Ellie looked at him, this man who had given his ranch for a stranger and was still standing, still steady. Something behind her eyes loosened, like a knot slowly releasing. "I came here with a plan," she said quietly. "I had accounted for every variable." She exhaled. "I had not accounted for you." He reached out in the darkness and took her hand. She let him hold it. Outside, a lone rider could be heard retreating north toward town, back toward Voss, back toward a man who now knew his time was running short. On the kitchen table, beneath the floorboard, the documents waited. "Then we ride to the county seat at dawn," Ellie said. "Together." They rode out before the sun did. The plains were dark purple and silent, and the only sounds were hoofbeats and wind and the distant call of something wild in the hills. Caleb rode on the left. Ellie rode on the right. Between them, in a saddlebag strapped securely to Caleb's horse, the documents waited, patient and powerful and long overdue. Neither of them spoke much. They didn't need to. There was a particular kind of comfort that had grown between them over 2 weeks on that ranch, the kind that doesn't require filling every silence, because the silence itself has become companionable. Ellie rode with her back straight and her eyes forward. Caleb rode with one hand easy on the reins and the other close enough to reach her if he needed to. He needed to, sooner than expected. They were 6 miles from Harlow County seat when the riders came. 4 of them, materializing from a dry ravine to the east like something the darkness had been holding in reserve. Voss's men, the same silhouettes from the midnight raid, now operating in the gray pre-dawn with the confidence of men who believed themselves beyond consequence. "Give us the bag," the lead rider called out, "and you both ride home." Caleb said nothing. He glanced at Ellie. Ellie had already angled her horse left, drawing 2 of the riders instinctively in her direction. It was a surveyor's mind at work. She had read the terrain as they rode and knew the ravine narrowed sharply 40 yards west. 2 riders following her would lose their formation in the tight passage. They did. Caleb drove his horse hard to the right, cutting off the remaining 2 with a speed that caught them unprepared. There were no gunshots. Voss wanted the documents, not a murder charge. The riders grabbed and maneuvered and threatened, but Caleb held the saddlebag with an iron grip and pushed through the gap they left when they turned to regroup. Ellie cleared the ravine. Caleb cleared the riders. They did not stop riding until Harlow County seat rose before them in the early gold of morning, its courthouse flag just catching the first wind of the day. The county judge was a broad, unhurried man named Aldrich who had served 30 years on the bench and developed an instinct for truth, the way other men develop an instinct for weather. He received them in his chambers at 7:30, still holding his morning coffee, and said nothing while Ellie laid the documents before him one by one: deed records, survey falsifications, water rights fraud, sworn depositions, the altered title to Holt Ranch. He read in silence for a long time. When he finally set the last page down, he looked at Ellie over the rims of his spectacles. "You carried these from St. Louis alone?" "Yes, sir." He looked at Caleb. "And you?" "I just made sure she got here," Caleb said. Judge Aldrich was quiet for another moment. Then he reached for his pen. "Colonel Harlan Voss's assets will be frozen by noon. Federal investigators will be contacted by end of day. And every fraudulent land claim he has filed in this county," he signed the first order with a firm hand, "is hereby under immediate review." The pen came down like a gavel. The news reached Dusty Creek before they did. By the time Caleb and Ellie rode back into town that afternoon, something had already shifted in the air, the particular lightness that settles over a place when a long pressure is suddenly released. People stood in doorways. The feed store owner, whose land title had been under dispute for 4 years, was sitting on his steps with his face in his hands, not from grief, but from the overwhelming relief of a man who had stopped expecting good news. Families who had surrendered to Voss's fraudulent claims received notice that their cases were reopened. The water rights manipulated for years were flagged for federal restoration. One by one, like windows being unshuttered after a long storm, things began to let in light. The townspeople looked at Ellie differently now. The woman they had watched stand on that auction platform, too old, too proud, too sharp about the eyes, had been the one carrying their salvation in a locked satchel the whole time. A few people couldn't quite meet her gaze. Most of them simply stepped forward and said thank you, plainly and genuinely, the way people do when words are all they have, and they mean every one of them. Ellie received each one with quiet grace. Because Judge Aldrich's order also confirmed what the original federal survey showed, that the deed Voss had manipulated 7 years ago was fraudulent. The auction bid was rendered legally void. The ranch belonged to Caleb Holt, fully and without dispute, as it always should have. He got his land back, but standing outside the ranch gate that evening, watching the sun lower itself behind the western hills in long ribbons of amber and rose, Caleb found he was thinking very little about the land. Ellie stood beside him, the empty satchel hanging from her hand, its purpose finally, completely fulfilled. The windmill turned slowly. The garden beside the porch caught the last of the light. She had never had a place that felt like it was waiting for her. She had never let herself want one. She was reconsidering that. Caleb turned to her. He took off his hat, which was the closest thing he had to ceremony, and held it against his chest. "You came here to save a town," he said. "Turns out you saved something else too." He paused. "Me." Ellie looked at him, this quiet, steady man who had seen her worth on a platform before knowing a single thing about her, and had not once stopped seeing it since. "I think I rode into Dusty Creek," she said softly, "for more reasons than I knew." He reached out and took her hand, not in the dark this time, not in the aftermath of danger, but in the full and generous light of evening with the whole sky watching. "Stay," he said. "Not for any auction, not for any arrangement." His voice was unhurried and sure, the way everything about him was. "Stay because I love you, Ellie Marsh, and because this place loves you too, even if it took a while to show it." She laughed that real, unguarded laugh and leaned her shoulder against his. "Ask me properly," she said. He got down on one knee right there in the dust and the amber light, holding her hand with the windmill turning and the town of Dusty Creek quiet and healing in the distance. She said yes before he finished the sentence. They married on a Saturday 3 weeks later on the front lawn of the ranch. The whole town came. The feed store owner, the shopkeeper who had been warned away from bidding, the families whose land was slowly, steadily being returned to them. Judge Aldrich rode in from Harlow County seat and stood in the front row with his hat over his heart. Even old Pickett, the auctioneer, stood at the back with his string tie on and his throat, for once not requiring clearing. Ellie wore a dress the color of the morning sky. Caleb wore his cleanest shirt and his good boots, and the expression of a man who cannot believe his fortune and intends to spend the rest of his life being worthy of it. When it was done, they walked together to the ranch gate. Someone in the crowd nobody ever admitted who had hung a new sign beside the old one. Freshly painted, the letters clean and certain. Holt and Marsh Ranch. Ellie read it once. Then she turned and looked at the man beside her, her husband, and at the town behind her, alive and free and full of people who now knew exactly what she was worth. She had known all along. It had simply taken the rest of the world a little time to catch up.